10,000 strong, I'll make my stand. My Union brothers, all there with me. We ain't coming home till Sheriff Chafin is hanging from a sour apple tree. I am a Union miner, and I'll work all night and day.
Basically, we're here to talk about the KKK and their effect on Lilly. And there was a young lady in the back, I didn't get her name, wants to lead us in a short prayer. President of the Lilly, Lilly Washington Township Historical Society.
My name is Bev Mandachek. So bow your heads. Bless us, O Lord, for these thy gifts, which we are about to receive from your bounty, through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you for all our gifts, for good health, and get us through this quiet week for Passion Week. Thank you.
Years ago, we did a program in Altoona with the railroad workers, and we stopped by here with Jim Saloni, who met with him and discussed the things that were happening here in Lilly in the 1920s, specifically the KKK attack on this town. The outcome of that was we did a small program over at the Legion here in Lilly, and we presented Jim Saloni with an award for his community service, and that worked out very well. It was just, but we didn't really advertise it or just tell anybody, but we always kept Lilly and Windber in the back of our minds because we wanted to come back here someday and do our thing. And the way the program, our organizations are set up is 1 year we meet in Western Pennsylvania, the next year we meet in Eastern Pennsylvania. And these kind of programs take a year to put together. So this year we're in Lilly and Windber, and we want to welcome everybody that's not from this community. Welcome to Lilly. This is a home where the Klan tried to made a feeble attempt to intimidate the citizens of this fine, fair community. With that being said, I'd like to introduce the president of the local union here to come up here and introduce our keynote speaker. Tom's also going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll open the meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Like Nick said, my name is Tom Mardula, and I'm the current president of Local 1318 here in Lilly. We were originally in Portage, and we were chartered in, I believe, 1973. I've been the president since about 86, so 30 plus years now. We're a very small local. At the max, we had probably 70, 75 people, and that was in the late 70s and early 80s. Currently, we have 13 members. So it's a challenge to keep our local going financially and people-wise. We've been operating volunteer-wise for probably 20-some years now because there's not enough money to pay the officers. But we still maintain, and it's been a blessing to do it. I'm also president of the Lilly War Memorial Association, which manages the field up here and all the events that happen there. So it's pretty much a full-time job. I would like to thank everybody for showing up today. It's nice to see this kind of participation, and everybody has an interest in what's going on labor-wise and history-wise. I guess my next issue would be to invite our keynote speaker, who is Mr. Chuck Knisell, the International Vice President of District 2. Mr. Chuck Knisell.
I'm going to shut this off. I don't think I need a microphone. First of all, thank you. I've never been a keynote speaker anywhere. I'd like to recognize I've got the group of guys that work with me. We got Danny Kane, we got Frank Ruddaball. My brother here invited me months ago, which I was honored to even have the opportunity to come and do this. But it's always a good day when people come together to stand against fascism, racism, and hate. It's always a good day. In the world that we live in today, we're this close to falling backwards to where we were in 1924. But we have the will of the people, the will of the coal miners and the wives, and they're just as tough. Probably twice as tough. My mother was married to a coal miner. She was a bank teller. Usually when I tell my friends she's a bank teller, they think that she made a lot of money. No, she didn't make a lot of money, barely over minimum wage. Dad worked in the mines, but Mom was a strong one. Mom had to be there when Dad had to go on the picket lines and deal with the kids. When the strike was going on and Dad wasn't coming home, Mom was there. And Mom wasn't only there just to feed us and dress us, but she was there to whip her butts too. So driving through Appalachia and the Allegheny Mountains, someone that may be from New York City or New Jersey, wherever, they could drive through these valleys and not know anything that ever happened here. But the amount of historical activity that's happened in these communities is actually unbelievable. But I think where we're lacking here, and like I said earlier, we're only this far away of falling backwards, is because we're not educating our children on what really happened in these coal communities and why these coal communities are even here. A lot of these coal communities came from a coal company from Europe that they found coal here. So they built everything around, and then they built the company houses, and they built the company stores. And they paid them in fake money. They paid them scrip, not even American dollars. Paid them in scrip, so everything that they worked for went right straight back to the company. I'll never compare that to slavery, but it's pretty darn close. But that's where we've been. And where we're going to go now, that's up to us. But when you have functions like this and you have gatherings like this is a way to educate our children, because they're not getting educated properly in school, and it's not the teacher's fault. I love teachers. My sister's a teacher. Got a lot of sisters and brothers that are teachers. Somebody controls what we educate our children. They don't want to tell them the truth and the true struggles. The Ku Klux Klan, unfortunately, they're still alive. How? Because there's other people out there that support their hate. They're in my community. It wasn't too long ago, I own a farm in Greene County, Pennsylvania, and I drove down the road and pulled into my buddy's place, and I seen a bag. Looked like a sandwich bag laying in the yard, so I went to go pick it up, and there was a note in there. It was full of birdseed. It was from the Ku Klux Klan. This wasn't too long ago, and the letter said, I think it said something to the effect, this time is a soft warning, the next time it'll be a brick through your window. So I'm thinking to myself now, why in the world would they throw this to my buddy's house? Doesn't make any sense. Just as he used to be an iron worker, well, he was an iron worker for 40 years. His wife worked for General Motors in Ohio. Just a pretty much farmer. That's all he does. He farms, he raises cattle. Why would they make a shot at my buddy Bill? It's because he's Catholic. Catholic. I don't understand how people could live a life like that, full of hate. But thank God we've got people that will stand up against it. I think what we should do moving forward, because this union the United Mine Workers has been around since 1890. And we fought this year after year after year. The best thing we could do is continue to educate, continue to get together like this. But one thing about our union that is probably the proudest part of our union is when it was formed back in 1890, they all got together. Now, how in the world they all got to Columbus, Ohio, I'll never know. Now, think about that, 1890. Last night, my brother Casey back there, he said, where you want to meet at? I live in Morgantown, West Virginia, so we met up around Evansburg. But it's as simple as me getting in the vehicle and going and picking him up and then driving here. Now, think about how they got around back in 1890. But they all went to Columbus, Ohio. And they couldn't even speak to each other. Italian, Polish, African American folks. We even had people that were, pretty much name any ethnicity, they were there. They couldn't even speak together, but they came up with a constitution, and there were rules. And number one rule was you can never discriminate against another brother or sister because of their race, religion, color. Pretty much settled it up right there. They knew that they had to get together because together, that's strength. They knew they had to fight together in order to be able to go to work and not get blown up in the coal mine. And it didn't matter if you're white or black, male or female, whatever the case may be. We've had women that have came through. Mother Jones, Sister Blizzard, that came from Appalachia, Cabin Creek, and have fought with us. But we're still here. The beauty of the strength of the activities that have happened through the past and the struggles and the fights and the running the Klan out of here has developed this organization into more than just coal miners. We represent teachers, we represent screen printers, we represent prison guards. Goes back to the point. Doesn't matter if you're black or white. Doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. We're all coming together collectively to continue this on. This needs to be here for our children. This needs to be here for the folks that aren't even born yet. They have to have it because there's always going to be somebody like the Klan. There's always going to be somebody like the coal companies that are going to try to bring people down and take things from them. But like I said, it's an honor to be here. I want to thank the local union for everything you do to put this together. And thank you for making me a keynote speaker so I could say I've done that. But it's always strange to me. My brother, Danny Kane here, he's the Secretary Treasurer Emeritus. He was one of my Secretary Treasurers. But it's an honor to be able to stand and be with you folks. On that, I'm going to go, but keep doing what you're doing. It's a great thing. It's noble. It's righteous. Keep it up. Thank you.
Introduce the president of the Pennsylvania Labor History Society, Jim Young. Where is he sitting now?
Jimmy, stand up. There we go.
There he is, back there in the back. We don't have the president of the Battle of Homestead Foundation is not here today. He did not make it. Well, we have Rose Trump and Charlie McAllister are both on the board of the Pennsylvania Battle of Homestead Foundation.
Howard Scott.
Oh my God, yes. The guy that puts together our the Pennsylvania Labor History Society annual book and printed this up for us. It's Howard Scott in the back of the room there, the tall guy. This is an open...
Yeah, I guess so.
Please come forward. This is, if you notice, I'm going way off script here, but I think it's important to live by our motto of an open mic and get everybody to say a few words. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Oh, yeah, you're ready.
I got to tell you how much I'm encouraged by what Chuck had to say about what's happening in this country. We live in the country that we do because people 100 years ago stood up to hate. They stood up to prejudice. You know, we wind up listening to people who don't have our best interest at heart. I'm tired of people solving problems in this country by telling us who to hate and who to fear.
Thank you.
It's time to stop. You know, I was looking through some old papers the other day, and I found a speech that I made at a district convention. I don't remember when it was. We were at Naniglow. Nick was there. And I talked about the rise of the new right. This was probably 30 years ago. The right wing in this country is getting stronger and stronger, and it's time for us to put a stop to it. An English philosopher named Edmund Burke once said, "The only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." That's what's happening in this country. We have people who should know better, and they're just standing by and watching all this hatred brew around us. Well, I'm not going to put up with it. I'm going to take a stand. I'm going to start going to school board meetings. I'm going to start going to borough council meetings. I'm going to start getting involved in everything around the community, and where these people stand up and take a stand for the evil that is out there, I'm going to speak up. I ask for you to do the same. When you hear people talking, about solving the problems of this country by who they can hate, speak up against them. When you're listening to somebody in a restaurant and a bar and they start spewing this hate, tell them about it. Call them to task. You know, there's still a lot of good in this country. There still is. We were a better country when we had more people organized into unions.
Amen. Yeah.
And I've been fortunate. When I got out of college and went to work in the coal mines right away, listen, I was thrilled. A lot of people said, "What the hell are you doing working in the coal mines? You just got out of college." I'm doing it because it's organized, it's represented by the United Mine Workers of America, the greatest union on the earth. And it's time we get back to that attitude in this country. That we recognize that everyone should belong to a union, and everybody should stand up for what's right in the workplace. So I'm going to get down off my soapbox here briefly, because you get me going and I could go on forever. But listen, I want to thank you for everything you do for the union. I want to thank my brother Jacqui Knisell for the kind words, and I feel fortunate to have guys like him and some of the other younger guys who have taken up the leadership mantle in this union now that some of us have retired. Give Jacqui a hand. So thanks a lot for everything that you do for working people, and keep fighting for what's right.
First we're going to have speak is Jacqui Cavalier. She's going to talk about how women took the vote. And I think we've already heard from Chuck Knisell about the strength of women in our community, and I believe that Jackie's going to give us some proper guidance in that direction.
Thanks,
Jacqui Cavalier.
My name's Jacqui Cavalier, and I am a professor of history at the Community College of Allegheny County in Pittsburgh. And I'm a proud member of the Battle of Homestead Foundation, and I am a member of the AFT and a former AFT vice president for the local 2067. And I can't agree more with the gentlemen who came before me. Interestingly enough, teaching in the community college and teaching history in the community college, I have the honor of encountering students from all walks of life. I'm not at a quote, university where there's the more traditional age students who are coming in at 18, 19, 20. But I have students who are of traditional age, students who are younger than that, students who are quite older than that, students who have worked and lost their jobs and returned to school to retrain or, change careers midstream, whatever the case might be. I've been there for 22 years. I never thought I'd see the day where teaching history became such a challenge at the college level. It really causes a moment of pause as I'm putting together information, as I'm looking at materials I've used in the past and wondering how they might be interpreted or misinterpreted today. And it's, like I said, it's quite a challenge. The Union, of course, is near and dear to my heart. My grandfather immigrated to the United States from Italy in 1913, and he went straight to the coal mine. And my father, who just passed, I've just buried my father on Wednesday. My father was a true blue Union man. And for those of you who've heard me speak before, you know I tell the story over and over again. There was never a day that we sat down at the table that my dad didn't remind us that it was the Union who put the food on the table. And it was the Union who provided the house that we lived in because he had a good Union job. And it was the Union who allowed for our education. And of course, the list goes on. My mother predeceased my dad by 3 months in December. They were married for 71 years. And while my mom was a traditional homemaker, wonderful mother, wonderful wife, I always chuckle when I talk about women's rights and the women's rights movement. Because I used to tease my mom when she was in her 70s and she decided at that point in time that she was going to lead her own revolt and her own strike against my dad. And she threw down the gauntlet and said, "No more cooking. From now on, we're going out to eat." In fact, we made her a little protest sign. So she was on strike for sure from that point on. Courage in women is often mistaken for insanity. These words are seen on bumper stickers, posters, pins, and the like. It's a phrase that might give one a moment for pause, a moment of consideration, and then it becomes one of those historical quotes in which we are familiar, but we're not quite certain why. Those profound words were delivered in response to the question, is she insane? The she in this case was Alice Paul, and the man who responded so insightly was the doctor who was sent to evaluate her as she sat in the psychiatric ward of the district jail in 1917. It was there that her tortured body was in full-blown starvation mode, and she was forcibly fed as a consequence of her self-induced hunger strike. 3 years later, on August 18th, 1920, Alice Paul and her allies, including Lucy Burns and other loyal members of the National Women's Party, would unfurl a purple and white ratification banner from the balcony of their suffrage headquarters in Washington, D.C. The banner donned 36 gold victory stars, one for each of the 36 states that ratified the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, otherwise known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. It never fails when we discuss suffrage, and I think when suffrage is taught, the image that comes into our mind is, of course, of people like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And at that point, I think the imagery that we have is they're well up in age. It's worth mentioning that, of course, the risks of these women were instrumental in moving the cause forward, especially after the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, which gave African American men the right to vote following the American Civil War, but negated to include women at that point. But it's also important to mention that by the time the 19th Amendment was ratified, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and many of the members of what were considered the old guard were gone, dead, by about 14 years by that point in time. It was the new guard suffragists who really took up the mantle and led the way in the period between 1910 and 1920. I'm always struck how students really have a limited understanding of suffrage, and it's embodied in Susan B. Anthony. And again, of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but a big piece of the puzzle is left out. Perhaps it's because the amendment itself is her namesake, or perhaps, and maybe more likely, there's a whole other part of the story that's skipped over rather intentionally. It's because that new guard, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns, Doris Stevens, Inez Mulholland, and countless others were willing to employ radical, if not blatantly militant tactics to bring attention to their plight and risk their lives for the right to vote. This approach was often not sanctioned by members of the old guard, and sometimes it was publicly denounced by that group until much later when they finally came on board. For years, the disciples of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton advocated for a state-by-state campaign for women to get the right to vote. It was gradual, and it required tremendous patience. The New Guard, the members of the National Women's Party, championed a constitutional amendment. It was radical indeed at that time, right? A constitutional amendment that would give all women everywhere in the United States the right to vote in local, state, and national elections. Now, there's a little bit of history that's important here, because if we think about this, key period between 1910 and 1920, that 10-year period of time, Woodrow Wilson, who is a Southern Democrat, Wilson was the first Southern-born president post-Civil War. Of course, he was a professor of political science. Wilson was the president of Princeton University. He becomes governor of New Jersey and president of the United States, but he was born in Virginia, okay? So you have the Southern Democrats, right, who are represented once Wilson comes to office, elected in 1912 and inaugurated in 1913. So the strategy of the National Women's Party was very much laser focused on Woodrow Wilson. So much so that on the day that Wilson is inaugurated in Washington, D.C., the National Women's Party and the congressional committee that is formed in conjunction with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they petition for a permit for a parade. And this large parade of suffragists march down Pennsylvania Avenue and take much of the attention away from Woodrow Wilson that day as he is being inaugurated. This is the first of only many political tactics that will be employed by the suffragists during Wilson's administration. Under the leadership of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, both college-educated, middle to upper class white women, the National Women's Party worked to mobilize women from different walks of life. Unfortunately, it was a bit limited. But when we think about the intersection between labor and suffrage, we cannot preclude the importance of the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. That fire is pretty fresh in their minds at that point in time. If you think about it, with Woodrow Wilson being inaugurated in 1913, the fire occurred, of course, in 1911. 146 women lost their lives, most of whom were immigrant women. It's important to mention also that prior to that tragic event, those same women were striking and petitioning for better wages and a shorter workday. Alice Paul reinforced that voting rights, what voting rights meant for women, and especially for working women who were lower on the socioeconomic ladder, a vote is a fire escape. A vote is a fire escape. This statement is attributed to her in popular culture, and whether she actually spoke those words or not, we don't know. However, it is the meaning of that statement that was effectively conveyed through her efforts. A vote was fair wages, a safe working environment, and a voice in the government that would change the laws. In other words, something we all know, a vote was power, and it was power for those who were otherwise powerless in a patriarchal society who made the laws for them. While this effort was a noble cause indeed, the movement did not work in the same manner, unfortunately, to mobilize African American women. Racism ran deep in the America of that time, and especially in the Democratic Party, and it certainly spilled over into the suffrage movement. Mainstream organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association permitted very few African American women to even attend their meetings. In some instances, African American women, African American suffragists, were not permitted to stand up and speak in those meetings and conventions. And the National Women's Party under Paul's leadership had to navigate that racial divide of the Democratic Party through their relentless efforts in lobbying members of Congress. In a strategy that intended to put intense pressure on public officials, it was the intentional choice of the National Women's Party not to alienate Southern Democrats by touting their commitment to black women's suffrage and racial equality. Now, these flaws, of course, did not go unnoticed, and prominent African American feminist activists, people like Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells Barnett, were constantly, of course, bringing attention. Racial prejudice cloaked in politics had no place in a movement where winning the vote was to serve as an emblem of equality for women, an emblem of equality. Upon the request from Paul and other members of the National Women's Party on the day of the suffrage parade in 1913, the request was that women of color do not march. They do not step in place with their white counterparts. And some of these women, of course, were college-educated, college graduates, just the same as many of those members of the National Women's Party. Ida B. Wells commented, she responded on this by saying, "Either I go with you or not at all. I'm not taking this stand because I personally wish for recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." She and other black suffragists clearly understood the importance of representation on a much larger scale, while Paul did not. And although many activists believe that the struggle for suffrage and racial equality went hand in hand, the political strategy of Paul and the National Women's Party was laser focused on Wilson, and ultimately the consequence of his re-election in 1916. How do we reconcile this contradiction? It's very difficult to do. Wilson's 1916 campaign slogan, ironically, was "He kept us out of war." He was reelected. He kept us out of war. We inaugurated presidents in March then, not in January like we do now. So Wilson was reelected in 1916. He was inaugurated in March of 1917, and the United States promptly entered the war in April of 1917. Leading up to the November election, the suffragists of Alice Paul's National Women's Party lobbied for the federal amendment in a very aggressive and tireless way. What they did was set up pickets, the silent sentinels, as they called themselves. And they picketed Woodrow Wilson on his doorstep, on the doorstep to the White House. Day after day after day, they stood. Rain, snow, sleet, hot sun, you name it. They stood on Wilson's doorstep. And oftentimes the strategy that they employed was making Wilson eat his own words. Because of course they would take his speeches as he was attempting to make the world safe for democracy, and they would play it back to him on these banners. One banner read, "Mr. President, you say liberty is the fundamental demand of the human spirit." Another, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And one in particular, Alice Paul's, was much more straightforward. "Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye." The suffragists who held these banners stood silent through it all. And then came the declaration of war from the United States. Many thought the Sentinels would stop. They certainly would not picket a wartime president. They would do what was respectful, what was ladylike, and what was right. But just like clockwork, the silent sentinels appeared the very next day. Signature banners in hand and courage in their heart. They were ready to continue their political protest. Now, of course, picketing the president in front of the White House, they're on public property. So the challenge was, how could they remove these women from Wilson's doorstep? It's estimated that nearly 2,000 women spent time on the picket lines between 1917 and 1919. 500 of these women were arrested, and 168 of them were actually jailed. Their offense was obstructing traffic. They had the option of paying a fine or going to jail. And paying the fine, of course, would be admitting guilt. So instead of admitting guilt for something that was not wrong, they chose to go to jail. This act, too, was very well organized by members of the National Women's Party under the leadership of Alice Paul. Most of the women ended up in a workhouse in Virginia, but they wanted Paul. And so she remained in the District of Columbia, the DC jail. As a result of their protest activities, the suffragists were stripped naked, beaten, kicked, and chained to the bars in their cells. So horrific was the torture that took place in the workhouse on November 14th, 1917. It's remembered as the Night of Terror. And our friend Bill Yund from the Battle of Homestead Foundation, I did have a wonderful slide, did a fabulous piece of art depicting this. It's worth mentioning that Alice Paul was a Quaker. She practiced the principles of pacifism, social justice, and service. She and Lucy Burns had spent an extensive time in England learning strategic militant tactics from the British suffragists there. Which brings us back to Alice Paul's hunger strike and her psychiatric evaluation as a result. Even in the most weakened state, Alice Paul, through an extremely well-organized network, was able to have notes documenting her experiences smuggled out of the psychiatric ward and delivered to Doris Stevens, who was leading the National Women's Party in her absence. Paul's words were shared with members of the press, who not only published them, but soon enough, Paul and her counterparts were being referred to as political prisoners. So you can imagine there would be nothing worse in the midst of the war, World War I, while Wilson is drafting his 14 points and thinking about how to study and remove the causes of future war and make the world safe for democracy. The depiction that America has political prisoners, of course, would not fare well. This really became a tipping point, and it's one of the most important aspects of the suffragist movement, that wartime protest. We have to wonder, had it not been for the war, had it not been for this pressure, this intense pressure, would we have had the 19th Amendment? Because, at that point in time anyway, because the intense pressure was, of course, on Wilson, and he agreed to support a constitutional amendment. So the first step was the release of Alice Paul and her counterparts. They were later pardoned. And then, of course, the passage of the amendment. On January 9th, 1918, approximately 10 months before World War I ended, Woodrow Wilson endorsed the 19th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. The House of Representatives followed a couple days later. Passage in the Senate was delayed, and as a result, the members of the National Women's Party took up their banners and started all over again. Protests and pickets in front of the Capitol, the Senate building, and the White House. They expanded their horizons at that point, delivering speeches, engaging in marches and rallies all across the United States. And then finally, in August 1920, Tennessee became the last state to ratify the 19th Amendment. On August 26, 1920, it was signed into law. 3 years ago, we just celebrated, of course, the centennial. One might think that the Crusaders for suffrage took a deep sigh of relief and went on to live their lives at that point, living happily ever after, finally winning that long right to vote. And some probably did, but not Alice Paul. She went right back to work. She's surrounded by herself with other activist-minded women, people like Crystal Eastman. And it was she and Crystal Eastman in 1923 who then authored the Equal Rights Amendment. It's very simply put, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States on any account, or any state, on account of sex. In the 1920s, under Paul's leadership, the National Women's Party drafted 600 pieces of legislation. 600 pieces of legislation in support of equal rights for women on the state, local, and national levels, including bills covering divorce and custody rights, jury service, property rights, ability to enter into contracts, and the reinstatement of one's maiden name after marriage. The lobbying efforts of the National Women's Party assisted in the adoption of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, and they campaigned for the inclusion of Title IX in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's important to mention that when we think about suffrage, remember the goal of the constitutional amendment, giving all women the right to vote. Unfortunately, even though the amendment was ratified, we know that all women did not have the right to vote. African American women of the American South were fighting Jim Crow. state-sanctioned segregation and racism. Certainly, Native American women are not even considered citizens of the United States. And even after 1924, when citizenship is extended to them, women are still prevented from having that right. So it's very important that while we look at the 19th Amendment as a brushstroke, right, we remember that not all women had the right to vote as a result of the 19th Amendment. In his work, Professor Peter Dreyer stated that we need to understand that many of the leading progressive thinkers and activists were heroes, but not saints. All of them had flaws, some personal and some political. It is important not to put them on too high a pedestal. I believe Alice Paul is one of those flawed progressives. She has been described as a racist, autocratic, certainly politically militant. But she was right about one thing: a vote is power, and it's much more than a fire escape. Alice Paul famously said that there will never be a new world order until women are part of it. I'll go one step further to proclaim that we need women leading it. Our journey is far from complete, but the important thing is that we have the intersection of organized labor, those advocating for women's rights. If we think about equal pay, if we think about gender equity in the United States, racial equity in the United States, if we think about women's reproductive health, if we think about the fact that we are looking at an industrialized country with one of the highest maternal mortality rates, what is wrong?
Especially for Black women.
Exactly. So the journey is not over, and I hope that we can continue to take up the mantle and stand on the shoulders of these women who came before us. Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a comment. That was a great presentation. There's a wonderful movie, Iron-Jawed Angels.
Yeah.
That if anybody, because you couldn't see what they were doing there on your screen, but Iron-Jawed Angels, it's a movie, it's been around for, I don't know, say 12 years. But it's a wonderful depiction of Alice Paul and the silent sentinels that were at the White House. If anybody wants to look it up.
Thank you. I just want to add, too, the PBS, the American Experience, has a two-part documentary. It's quite lengthy. It's an hour and a half each part, so it's a total of 3 hours. But it's called The Vote, and it was done for the centennial celebration. But it really delves using a lot of, primary footage and documents and so on and so forth. But it also looks at, of course, the racial disparity as well. So it's a great documentary, and you can watch it streaming on PBS.
Thank you, Jacqui. Certainly appreciate it.